Welcome to a taste of Old Colony history, where we try historic recipes and local favorites right here in our home kitchens. This time, our recipe comes from the Old Colony History Museum's temporary exhibit titled "We Are What We Eat," and we are baking on a budget. We're making poor man's cake and topping it with poor man's frosting. Let's get cooking. Here are the tools and ingredients we'll need to make our poor man's cake. We have cinnamon, salt, sugar, flour. We'll need some water, raisins, cloves, baking powder, baking soda, and lard. Since lard is a little harder to come by in 2022, we're gonna use an alternative, and that will be our vegetable Crisco shortening. There are a number of modern alternatives that you can use. For tools, we will need a saucepan, a wooden spoon, a wet measure, and a 1 cup dry measure, as well as a teaspoon measure. If you're using whole cloves like I am, you will need to break those down with a mortar and pestle, and then a 13x9 baking pan. So the first step for making our poor man's cake is to preheat our oven. We're going to set it to 350 degrees. Get that going, and then we're going to start on our wet ingredients in our saucepan, and once those boil for a little bit, we'll add our dry ingredients. So in this saucepan, we need 2 cups of water, a teaspoon of cinnamon, a teaspoon of salt, 2 cups of sugar, 2 cups of raisins. If you're using whole cloves like I am, we're going to need our little mortar and pestle to help us to grind these. And we're going to need a teaspoon in total, so not a lot. Smells like the holidays. Just about a teaspoon. Go. All right. And then we need 1 cup of lard for this recipe. But as I said, lard is a little harder to come by in 2022 than it was in the Depression era, but there are tons of modern alternatives. But vegetable shortening is the closest that you can use. The fat content is almost identical, so you don't have to do any ratios. It's just 1-to-1. And of course, using a vegetable shortening like Crisco makes it vegetarian and vegan friendly. So we're gonna use that. So we need 1 cup of lard into this mixture. Add this. And let this all heat up together, and it needs to boil for 5 minutes. So while our sugar and fat and spices are sort of getting together in this pot, we're gonna get our dry ingredients ready, because we'll add them once it's boiled for 5 minutes. So we need 3 to 4 cups of flour. I'm gonna do 3.5. Now we need 2 teaspoons of baking soda, and then we need 1 of baking powder. And we need both of these to help us get that rise on this cake, because we're not using any egg. So, stirring this around. Needs to. Our oven is up to temperature. We just need this all to boil. So we have a couple more minutes. So while this hangs out, we can get our pan ready. We're gonna grease and flour this. I like to just use a little bit of paper towel, some shortening, and just rub it all over. So it's pretty well covered in shortening. Add some flour. Sprinkle this all over. Shake it. All right. So all the excess, tap down to one side, and I'm going to dump that in the trash. And now we're ready for our cake. All right, so this is definitely boiling. I'm going to set a timer so that it cooks together for 5 minutes. We're going to keep stirring it, and then we'll add our flour. Smells really good. Cinnamon and cloves. Just want to keep stirring so None of those raisins or anything sticks to the bottom and burns.
You know I'm gonna wait on you. I'm gonna wait on you. You know I'm gonna wait on you. Yes, I'm gonna wait on you.
1 more minute left. This beautiful caramelly color. So our sugar and fat and spices have boiled for 5 minutes. We remove them from the heat and we're gonna let this cool to a lukewarm temperature before we add our flour, baking powder, and baking soda that we are going to mix with a wooden spoon specifically. So we're gonna let this cool for just a few minutes. We're now going to add our dry ingredients and then stir them all together with a wooden spoon. I'm just gonna slowly add this. Add a little, give it a stir, and keep going. Now that this is all nicely combined, beautiful batter, we're going to pour this into our prepared baking sheet. Get as much out as I can. Scrape the rest. It's a very thick batter. Try to spread it as best I can. Now our cake will go into the oven for 50 to 60 minutes. My oven tends to take a little longer. I'm gonna set it for 50 and we'll check it, but as long as the center, when you stick a toothpick in the center, as long as it comes out clean, it's done. So we'll put it in and we'll check it in almost an hour. These are the ingredients and tools we will need to make our poor man's frosting for our cake. We need milk, flour, salt, sugar, margarine, vegetable shortening, and vanilla. For tools, you'll need a saucepan, a wet measuring cup, a 1 cup dry measure, a 1/2 cup dry measure, and a 1/4 cup dry measure, as well as a teaspoon measure. And you'll also need a whisk to stir our flour, milk, and salt together. And then when we add all our ingredients together, we're gonna use a small bowl and a hand mixer. So our first step in making our frosting is to mix together our milk, flour, and salt until they're all thick, and then it needs to cool pretty much all the way. So we're gonna add our 1 cup of milk, 1/4 cup of flour, and then just a dash of salt. Heat on, and this just needs to cook until it's thick. And that went pretty quickly once it heated up. I'm gonna take this off the heat. I'm gonna put it in a separate container to allow it to cool. Okay, so our flour, milk, and salt mixture has cooled. I cut up our 1 stick or 1/2 cup of margarine into our small bowl. And to this, we're gonna add 1/2 cup of vegetable shortening. And 1 cup of sugar. So we're gonna mix this with our electric mixer, get it all nicely combined. Now that this is all mixed together well, we're gonna add our flour mixture. And we also need a teaspoon of vanilla. A little over doesn't hurt. Mix this until it's fluffy like a stiff whipped cream. Looks like a good whipped cream. Give it a taste test. It tastes like whoopie pie filling. I love it. So once our cake is done and cooled, we'll top it with our frosting. So the 50-minute timer on our cake just went off. Take it out, test and see if it's done. I don't have any toothpicks, so we're gonna use a knife. Perfectly clean. It's good to go. Let this cool and then we'll frost it with our poor man's frosting. So our cake and our frosting are done. Our cake has been cooling for a little while. It's not totally cool yet, but we're gonna put some frosting on. And we put it all in the fridge and do a taste test tomorrow morning. Even. So I'm gonna cover this, put this in the refrigerator, and we'll try tasting tomorrow. All right, so it's time for the best part, our cake taste test. I just cut a nice corner piece. Frosting looks awesome, super thick. It's got great raisins all throughout. Let's taste. There's a lot of frosting. That's mostly all you can taste when you have it together. The frosting is like an old-fashioned whoopie pie filling. It's very sweet, I would say. A little bite of just cake. It's very tasty. You wouldn't really know there's not a ton of sugar. There's only, like, we used a whole cup in the whole cake, so it's dense. Mine's a little dry. I think I overbaked it a little bit. I usually anticipate my oven taking a little bit longer, but I think this one didn't need quite so long. So it might have been a little more moist and tasty if I hadn't overcooked it, but the flavors are nice. It's kind of bready. It tastes more like a breakfast food this way than like a cake, which is great because I'm tasting this in the morning. But overall, it's worth trying. It's tasty. It definitely has some more like fall flavors with the cinnamon and clove, so good as we transition into the cooler months. The frosting is really good. Like I said, it's pretty sweet, but it's very, very tasty, I think. And I'm glad that this cake has some frosting because I think it would not be so great without it. So try poor man's cake with poor man's frosting. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Just cook it a little less than I did. Enjoy.